مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. يا له من اقتصاد غريب. الخبر الجيد هو عن نسبة البطالة في أميركا الآن في أدنى مستوياتها منذ 50 عاما، أي منذ أن مشى الإنسان على سطح القمر. وأي شخص في بلدنا اليوم يسعى إلى وظيفة قد يجد واحدة على الأقل. لكن الخبر السيئ هو ارتفاع معدلات الفائدة قرابة 5% بعد أن كانت تقريبا بنسبة 0% بسبب مساعدة الاقتصاد على مواجهة جائحة كورونا، بالإضافة إلى الآثار السلبي على كل شيء بدءا من الرهنيات العقارية إلى ديون البطاقات الائتمانية. هذه الزيادات لم تتوقف بعد التضخم الذي لا يزال يرتفع بشكل خطر. هل هذه قصة خبر جيد أم خبر سيء أم الاثنين معا؟ ماذا بإمكان الحكومة أن تفعل لحماية الوظائف ولحماية المستهلكين من التضخم؟ هل للعجز والدين تأثير على الوضع؟ لمناقشة حالة الاقتصاد الأميركي وما تستطيع الحكومة فعله لتحسينه، يسرني أن أستضيف مراقبين ماليين مرموقين، وهما مارك هامريك وجيمس هنري. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Sometimes you have to scratch your head trying to figure out the American economy. The good news is often great. The bad news is often horrible. So what to do? Laugh or cry? Maybe our panelists, Mark Hemrick and James Henry, can explain. Thank you very much for joining us today. So, gentlemen, big picture. Is our economy fundamentally strong but facing some bumps in the road? Or does the apparent health of the economy mask some deeply ingrained, profoundly worrying problems? Or to put it in layman's terms, is the economic glass half empty or half full? James Henry.
Well, I'm not sure about the glass analogy. I think we have in the short run, we could look backwards and say that the economy is performing relatively well compared to history, and so we have unemployment at historical lows, 3.5%. We have economic growth at the end of the last year was resuming at about a 2.5% clip, which is pretty good for us historically. A lot of people were expecting a great recession here, and it looks like the jury is out. The Fed may have to do some more interest rate adjustments, but basically we've had a booming stock market, and a lot of people made a lot of dough in the real estate market as well. So it's kind of natural that that boom would come to an end. But on the other hand, I'd say going forward, this is there are a lot of fundamental issues that we need to grapple with. They have climate crisis on our hands, which we are, kind of one of the world leaders in addressing climate problems historically, climate and global warming. But the world as a whole has fallen behind. And the folks that we're arguing with a lot right now, China especially, to some extent, India, have become, the leading contributors to the global warming problem. We can't really solve that problem without global agreement. So that's one problem. The other problem we face is a dramatic increase in inequality and poverty in this country. I mean, just this disparity in living standards. If you look at homelessness, if you look at measures of hardship, and just the concentration of wealth in this country and the political power that goes along with it. I mean, those are fundamental structural problems that we have not figured out a way to address. I would also mention the soaring levels of debt in the federal government as a big problem, and that's something that has to do with tax policy. So whether this divided country politically can address those fundamental issues that we still face that are kind of structural is a real uncertainty, I think.
All right. Thank you for laying that out. Mark, when you look at the big picture, what do you see?
Well, Rob, first of all, thank you for having me. And to your first question, whether the glass is half full or half empty, I would point out that if a glass is actually in that condition, it is both. It is not one or the other. I agree a lot with what James had to say there. Maybe to try to break things down a little further, I think it's important to try to look at the performance of the economy in one of two ways, or two of two ways in a sense, and that is we look at it from the short-term and long-term perspective. And so in the short term, we would tend to say that that is cyclical, where the economy is in the economic cycle at the moment, and how it has performed in the long term. And of course, as we speak here in early 2023, we're still very much feeling the echoes of the COVID-19 pandemic, even though the pandemic itself is not regarded to really be as pressing of a health issue for the United States as it was in those dire early days, in part because of a robust response on the part of the federal government to help get people vaccinated, and the private sector obviously doing its part. But how that affects the economy is that fiscal authorities, or elected officials in Washington, meaning the president, as well as members of Congress, and then on the other hand, members of our central bank, the Federal Reserve, or the leaders of the central bank, all chimed in with robust responses aimed at rescuing the economy from historically high unemployment. We lost 22 million jobs in March and April of 2020. The unemployment rate really reached a post-depression high of 14.7%. And as we speak, the unemployment rate has already gone all the way down to a new sort of post-World War II low of, or at least at the lowest since 1969, of 3.4%. And with that, a strong response in the sense of employment, we still have a large number of unfilled jobs that are available for workers in the United States. The magnitude of the labor force has not returned to its pre-pandemic condition, meaning we don't have the same percentage of people who are looking for work or working. And we've had historically high inflation, the likes of which we haven't seen in this country for 40 years. So the Federal Reserve has had to go from, our central bank has had to go from taking its foot off the accelerator, meaning getting the car or the economy going, and really stomping on the brake. And remarkably, the US economy has performed better than expected thus far. As was noted by James earlier, and this is consistent with our bank rate surveys of economists. Economists over the previous 2 quarters or 6 months had said that the risk of a recession in essentially the coming 6 to 18 months was even. In other words, that the odds were split that we might experience an actual contraction in the US economy. We haven't seen that yet, and if anything, the US economy has performed better than expected so far in this early stage of 2023.
All right, let's dig a little bit deeper on some of these very important issues. Let's start with inflation. Now we're beaming into a part of the world that knows inflation numbers, that are astronomical compared to what we're dealing with in the United States. An annualized 24% in Egypt just in the last month of 2022, or try to swallow this, 189% in Lebanon, the first 11 months of last year. So a little bit of context. Now here it's nothing like that, but still historically high for America. Why? How did that happen? What is fueling, or what did fuel, and what to a certain extent continues to fuel inflation in our country? James?
Well, if you look at its sectoral composition, a lot of it was, especially last year, was food and energy. Obviously, the pandemic and the disruptions of supply chains had something to do with that explanation, but also, the disruptions in the energy market due to the Putin, sort of experiment, I think had a substantial, impact. It looks like the oil prices are now receding, and maybe that's an anticipation of a Fed response that will create another recession. But, a lot of the inflation that came last year was, I would say, just partly a response to the fact that the Fed had blown up the money supply. And in addition to these supply side factors, so you had the Federal Reserve expanding the growth rate of the money supply to fix the pandemic. It probably waited too long to correct that policy and to tighten. But in hindsight, it's always easy for us to criticize. It probably they finally decided to take away the punch bowl, and that was bringing inflation down. Until this very last
month. Translate very well, but okay.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to say this until this very last month, I was predicting inflation was continuing to fall, and it's kind of stopped falling. So one of the reasons stock markets are now anticipating, the Fed is going to have a couple more rate increases here, to curb inflation. So the economy basically has not been cooling as fast as we like, and inflation has not been falling as fast. I think there's also something to be said for the argument that there are structural problems in the U.S. economy that make it much easier to raise prices than to get them falling. And so we have some sectors that are basically cartels. We don't have the kind of antitrust enforcement that we used to have in the 70s when I was an antitrust lawyer. That whole framework for trying to get price controls under, sort of inflation under control by having more competition is something I think we need to look at a micro level. And there are a lot of sectors like the internet companies that are guilty of sort of absolutely no particular competition.
All right. Let me ask you.
Those are some factors that I think play into this continuing problem. But
okay. Mark, let me ask you about the role of the Federal Reserve, which is really the main tool that our system has to counter inflation. Has it succeeded? And if it hasn't succeeded yet, when do you expect it to succeed?
Yeah, very good question. The Federal Reserve is the main policeman on the inflation beat. There are some things that elected officials might do, but don't seem to be inclined to do, partly because of the division of the parties in our government. And so as one who's attended, for example, Federal Reserve news conferences since they began in 2011, it's something I pay a lot of attention to. And our Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell would be the first to say that the war against inflation in the United States has yet to be won. And when we see, for example, our headline inflation rate at 6%, that is above the Federal Reserve's target of 2%. And 2% is regarded as essentially a safe amount of inflation, or the amount of inflation that would be acceptable as the Federal Reserve looks at it. That's also consistent with trend economic growth in the United States. And so to the extent that we have had inflation closer to 10% in the recent past in the United States, I think the Federal Reserve would say, since it began raising interest rates in March of last year, that the medicine is working in the sense of inflation appears to have peaked, and obviously, as mentioned earlier, Russia's war against Ukraine exacerbated what was already essentially a global problem. But the Fed cannot yet say that it is won in the sense of getting inflation back down to 2%. So as mentioned earlier by James, we do expect the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates at least a couple more times, and that will get its benchmark rate up above the 5% level. And then that has effects across the economy. And I would just say that for those who don't necessarily watch what our central bank does on an ongoing basis like we do, we began to see those impacts very early in the process, I would say, with the U.S. stock market entering into a bear market, a crash in cryptocurrencies, and the housing market in the United States has now seen declining sales of previously owned homes for 12 straight months. So the housing market was red hot, the stock market was red hot. Some would say the cryptocurrency craze was literally crazy. And all of those bubbles have been burst to some degree, and we'll see whether this continuous series of moves on the part of the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates to try to cool the economy has more broader impacts, and whether we'll see a recession in the United States is a question only to be answered in the coming months. We will have a recession at some point. That's part of the economic cycle. It's a question of when it occurs, how deep it is, how severe it is, and how long it lasts.
And just before the break, Mark, how high do you think the Federal Reserve interest rate is going to go before the Fed declares victory?
Well, I would say we'll get an update on that here very soon during the next Federal Reserve meeting, when collectively members of the Federal Open Market Committee put down their projections for that. But right now the financial markets are penciling in sort of the end destination for their benchmark rate in the low to mid 5% range. But where they end up is entirely dependent on the performance of the economy, including how inflation presents itself or not in the coming months.
All right, when we come back after the break, we're going to talk more about what the other arms of the federal government can do, should do, aren't doing to address America's economic difficulties in just a moment. Again, my guests today include Mark Hamrick. Mark is Washington Bureau Chief and Senior Economic Analyst for Bankrate.com. Formerly, he helmed business news for the Associated Press for nearly 20 years. Mark is past president of the National Press Club here in Washington. Also joining us is James S. Henry. James is an economist, attorney, and senior fellow at Columbia University's Center for Sustainable Investment, a global justice fellow at Yale University, and senior advisor to the Tax Justice Network. A former chief economist at McKinsey & Company, the world's leading consulting firm, he is author of The Blood Bankers, Global Tax Fairness, and the forthcoming Pirate Bankers. So let me ask both of you, if you could wave your magic wands and have Congress and the president on the same page doing one thing to improve the American economy or to fix something in the American economy, what would that be? Mark, let me start with you on this round.
I'm going to have to beg off on that question, simply because we aren't in the business at Bankrate of prescribing essentially solutions for our elected officials. We're really all about trying to coach Americans to do better. But I would just simply go back to what I told you a moment ago, and that is anything that could better encourage Americans to save, both for emergencies so that they would not be among the minority of Americans that can draw from savings to pay an emergency expense of $1,000 or more. Anything that could help them to address that, as well as to help them to have more secure retirements. I think those would be problems that could heal a lot of financial distress in our country. If we can get past peak inflation, if we can see inflation closer to that 2% target, if the Federal Reserve can back off the interest rate hikes, then we may well have a confirmed bull market on our hands, meaning that stocks will be rallying in the intermediate term.
And James, do you agree with that?
I think we're going to have a fairly choppy stock market here until the Federal Reserve gets control of this situation. So, ordinary Americans probably should avoid the stock market at this point. We do have a savings problem in this country, and it's really shows up at the level of ordinary people not having any savings.
All right, Mark Hamrick, James Henry, thank you very much for helping to explain the state of the American economy to our viewers across the Middle East. Thank you for joining us in Dakhel, Washington. As we pass the first anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there is much that deserves comment. How heroic the Ukrainian people have been, defying all predictions in beating back the aggressors and defending their homeland. How the Ukrainian president, former comedian Volodymyr Zelensky, has risen to the challenge and emerged as the first great leader of the 21st century. How Joe Biden has emerged as the spine of the global coalition to support Ukraine in its hour of need, for as long as it takes, as he likes to say. And how Vladimir Putin not only miscalculated the ease with which Russia would swallow Ukraine, but how he keeps doubling down and doubling down again, defying the most basic of all strategic insights, known as the first law of holes. When you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. But that's not what I want to talk about today. Rather, I want to focus on the fact that so much of the world sees the last year's experience in Ukraine totally differently from what I just described. And that's because much of the world has been victimized by Russian propaganda, a deliberate effort by Moscow's intelligence agencies to export the big lie to unsuspecting media outlets and gullible populations. The lie is so big, it is often difficult to refute, but it is real, powerful, and scary. I saw it myself on a recent trip through the Middle East. I remember one dinner with some of the Arab world's most distinguished, experienced, and learned former diplomats, men of the world who knew their way around Davos, the United Nations, and the chancelleries of Europe. I won't embarrass my hosts by naming the country or the individuals involved, but I am still dumbstruck by the extent of the Russian propaganda I heard from these usually wise and well-informed men. The war will be over soon, I heard. The Russians are on the verge of victory. How can the Ukrainians last when the great Russian war machine is only beginning to rev up, when there are millions more Russian men ready to be sent to the front, I heard. There is blame on all sides, I heard. The Ukrainians were as responsible for this tragedy as the Russians, perhaps even more so. Putin is a real leader, they said, a man of vision, principle, and determination. And what is Zelensky? A man who tells jokes? And as for the accusations of atrocities and war crimes, just look at what the Ukrainians are doing, I heard, and so on and so forth. If it were only one evening's dinner table chatter, it wouldn't merit much concern. But the more I read about the indifference, neutrality, playing both sides strategy of numerous countries in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, I fear the enormity of Russia's propaganda success, a success much greater than Russia's battlefield prowess. We need to fight and defeat this Russian attack, an attack on truth, just as we support Ukraine in fighting and defeating the Russian attack on its soil and its people. We need a blitz of news and information in Arabic and every other local language in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East to counter Russian disinformation and present the real facts of a battle whose outcome will affect the ultimate fight between liberty and tyranny for the next generation. We need to fight this battle too. وصلنا إلى ختام هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كان لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول البرنامج وبالأخص بشأن دور الحكومة في الاقتصاد الأميركي، تواصلوا معي رجاء عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو راسلوني مباشرة على الرابط @RobSatloff. إلى اللقاء في الأسبوع القادم، حتى ذلك حين شكرا وإلى اللقاء.